Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Oceanic Network's first research webinar, Oil Mortalities and Offshore Wind in the News, presented by Sarah Sweat, Marine Renewable Energy and Communications Specialist at Oregon Sea Grant. My name is Silvana Gregg. I'm a policy associate here at the network and recent graduate earning my master's in coastal and ocean policy from UNC Wilmington, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. The Oceanic Network is a member-based nonprofit supporting the domestic supply chain through collaboration, education, and innovation. We host a number of educational and networking opportunities, one of them being our annual IPF conference, which is the largest offshore wind conference in the United States. We currently have over 500 member companies ranging from government agencies, small businesses, universities, and developers. And here's a breakdown of our current membership. This webinar series is to platform cutting-edge research in offshore wind, hosted monthly and presented by our academic members. Some brief housekeeping before we get started. Please utilize the chat feature to ask questions. We will include Sarah's contact information at the end. If we don't get to your question, we can follow up with you. And then I'll pass things over now to our presenter, Sarah Sweet, Marine Renewable Energy and Communications Specialist at Oregon Sea Grant.
All right. Thank you, Silvana. And let's get to this slide. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Sweat. I am going to be presenting research today that I did as a part of my master's in marine policy at University of Delaware. Currently, I work for Oregon Sea Grant, and I serve as the Marine Renewable Energy and Communities Extension Specialist. So I'm continuing my work focusing on offshore wind and its impact on coastal communities. All right, so this project is called Whale Mortalities and Offshore Wind Development in the News, analyzing the facts. So in 2023, whales really took center stage in the discussion of the East Coast's budding offshore wind industry and the US's offshore wind industry in general. Stories discussing whale mortalities in connection with offshore wind development started to break in early 2023 following a series of whale strandings in New York and New Jersey. And many began to describe these strandings as unprecedented and wondered what was causing them. Could recent offshore wind be a factor? So the media started to report on these speculations that survey work associated with the site assessment phase of nearby offshore wind projects may be playing a role in the mortalities of these large marine mammals. So this study aims to investigate how this issue has been presented in local, regional, and national news articles, and whether this media source is relying on the best available scientific information, and also what is the best available science, and then what are expert opinions on the alleged connection between whale mortalities and offshore wind development. So the study region includes this piece of the Mid-Atlantic, which is very busy for multiple reasons. Multiple commercial industries make use of this area of ocean. And preparation for development of offshore wind projects is just emerging as the newest factor in an already very busy marine space. This study region, which is inclusive of the New York Bight, has served as one of the main shipping gateways of North America's eastern seaboard. So multiple heavy transit routes exist in the study area to support commercial fishing in and out of the Port of New York and New Jersey, the Port of Philadelphia, and Port Wilmington in Delaware. This region also does support multiple commercial fisheries out of New Jersey for species like ocean quahogs, surf clams, sea scallops, and blue crabs. So here's that same map, but with an overlay of vessel monitoring system data from commercial shipping and fisheries, to give you a visualization of that spatial impact of these industries with the new presence of offshore wind shown with those lease areas. So in addition to these commercial industries, this area of the continental shelf also serves as necessary habitat and supports migratory corridors for large whales and marine mammals. Humpbacks, fin whales, minke whales, right whales, and sperm whales are all species that are often spotted along the Jersey Shore. So the first species that I focus on in this study is the humpback whale. And this population in the Atlantic has rebounded greatly since commercial whaling was completely outlawed at the end of the late 20th century for the species. In the Atlantic, there are 4 distinct population segments of humpbacks, meaning they're separate populations but still related. The population with its presence nearest to the east coast of the US is the West Indies distinct population segment. Within that distinct population segment, there's a Gulf of Maine stock, which feeds in and around the Gulf of Maine in the summer. And this distinct population segment was actually delisted from the Endangered Species Act in 2016, following a determination that the species population had rebounded significantly. So the migration pattern of this distinct population segment follows the Atlantic coast from winter breeding grounds down in the Caribbean to those summer feeding grounds up in these more northern regions. The next species that I looked into was the North Atlantic right whale, which did not have any instances of strandings in New York and New Jersey, but is a very important species because of their critically endangered status. And they're a resident along our coasts. Some people refer to them as the urban whale because their migratory corridor in the mid-Atlantic is very close to the coast. And they travel from their calving grounds along the southeast up to summer feeding grounds in that northeast, more northern area. And there has been year-round presence that has been documented with these species off the coast of New Jersey. And unlike humpbacks, the North Atlantic right whale population is small and fragile, and their coastal presence makes them even more susceptible to human impacts. So they are a species that is also given a lot of consideration when it comes to offshore wind development and its potential impacts. So both of these species are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which was passed in 1972, and that protects all marine mammal stocks regardless of population size. And there is a moratorium on the taking or importing of marine mammal products or marine mammals themselves. And taking is defined as harassment, hunting, capturing, or killing of marine mammals. So there are some exceptions to the takings of marine mammals, and incidental take permits can be authorized for different underwater sound disturbances that may affect marine mammal populations, such as military sonar exercises, oil and gas development, renewable energy activities, research, or other construction. And currently there are many offshore wind projects which have active or pending incidental take permits or incidental harassment permits. And these permits are only issued if the take is going to be of small numbers and would have no more than a negligible impact on the species or stock and no unmitigable adverse impact on availability for subsistence uses. So these incidental take permits could be authorized if there is going to be an impact from underwater noise. And sound is vital to marine mammals for communication, foraging, reproduction, and navigation. And the ocean is an increasingly noisy place. Offshore wind is just a new element in, like I said, a couple slides back, an already very busy ocean space. Close exposure to human-made sound could result in acoustic damage or disturbances to marine mammals, such as our humpbacks and right whales. And disturbances to the marine environment from anthropogenic impacts have been shown to physically impact or stress whales. High-power mid-frequency active sonar, which is a technology used in naval exercises, has coincided with beaked whale strandings, and where one instance whales, in a way to try to escape the loud disruptive noises, swam into a shallow lagoon and then ended up stranding. And then explosives have been shown to cause ear injuries in humpbacks, and then ship noise has also been shown to be a stressor for North Atlantic right whales. In an interesting study looking at stress hormones in right whales pre and post 9/11 near New York, after 9/11, when vessel traffic kind of came to a lull, there were less stress hormones found in the right whale samples that they were looking at. And both of these species, humpbacks and right whales, are baleen whales, which are not known to echolocate. They use sound primarily for communication. And studies have shown that humpbacks will increase their noise in their ambient environment because it's getting louder, kind of the same as if you were in a crowded restaurant or a crowded bar and you had to raise your voice to try to speak over other people. And then also in the case of mortality, necropsy teams will look for signs of acoustic trauma, although it's very hard to assess because some parts of the ear decompose very quickly. So both of these species have been a part of unusual mortality events that have been going on in the Atlantic since 2016 and 2017. So prior to 2023, there have been instances of strandings and mortalities and injuries that have been reported. So these strandings are not necessarily unprecedented. NOAA defines, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration defines an unusual mortality event as a stranding that is unexpected, involves a significant die-off of any marine mammal population, and demands an immediate response. So the leading documented causes of these unusual mortality events, or UMEs, are vessel strikes and entanglements. From necropsies of about 90 humpback individuals, which is about 1/3 of the humpbacks that have been a part of the UME. 40% of those mortalities had signs of human interaction. The remaining mortalities had undetermined causes of death or were from natural causes. And that human interaction was shown through vessel strikes and entanglement in fishing gear or loose rope and debris that's found in the ocean. So there are limitations to completing necropsies. You're probably wondering, if there are 227 mortalities recorded, how come there are only about 100 necropsies that have been done? Funding is a big limitation, and just there aren't a ton of teams that are specialized to do this sort of work too. And then carcasses that are found at sea floating, there are often issues on where to bring them to shore to complete a necropsy. And sometimes carcasses can be removed from public or private beaches before any necropsy team could even get to the scene. There's also been more funding from the right whales because of their endangered status. So since 2016, 227 humpback mortalities have been recorded along the East Coast, and since 2017, 142 right whale mortalities, and then also cases of serious injury and morbidity have been recorded in the US and Canada. And that UME includes injury and then also includes instances from Canada, just because of that much smaller population of right whales, which today is only around 330 individuals and only about 70 actively breeding females. So their population is very fragile and susceptible to both of these risks of vessel strike and entanglement. So to kind of look into this, I used a case study approach to look at the Jersey Shore, where this topic has been very contentious and circulating a lot through word of mouth or social media and other media sources. So I'm actually from New Jersey, and I kind of have a personal relationship to this because when I would visit home and people knew that I worked on offshore wind research, the first thing they would ask me is, does offshore wind kill the whales? Or, oh, I hear offshore wind's killing all these whales. So I kind of came in firsthand with this allegation, which made me curious to look into the science behind it. So in 2023, 8 dead humpbacks were recorded onshore and offshore. This is following an executive order with a pledge to achieve 11,000 megawatts of offshore wind for New Jersey by 2040. People started to circulate these allegations that offshore wind had some sort of connection to these humpback strandings. And many local towns and local and state politicians began to call for a moratorium or a stop to offshore wind until there was more information unearthed about the alleged connection. So my research questions, I was really curious to see how these different news sources at different levels of distribution are portraying the relationship between whale mortalities and offshore wind, and really, are those portrayals accurate? And are they based on the best available science? I was also curious to see if there are any difference in accuracy between local and national articles in their portrayal of the topic. And then also learning from expert opinion on what the main causes of humpback and right whale mortality, injury, and strandings are in the Atlantic. So to investigate these research questions, I used a media content analysis approach to examine how a subset of local, regional, and national articles address this topic. The second part of the study was expert interviews, semi-structured expert interviews, to learn what current expert opinion is on the topic and ground truth for the media content analysis. So for the local newspapers, I chose 2 newspapers based on highest circulation figures in the southernmost coastal counties of New Jersey, those that were in the closest proximity to active projects. And then I used national and regional articles from a separate search to create a subset for that media content analysis. And then the semi-structured interviews, I identified experts in marine acoustics and large whale injuries and mortality specialists. And those interview protocols included questions about those current unusual mortality events, vessel strikes, entanglements, potential impacts from offshore wind, from marine acoustics, etc. So now I'll present some of the findings that are coupled together from that content analysis and the expert interviews. And I have a little more background information that was kind of part of my own literature review of investigating that current science to support my findings in the discussion. So the first is that most articles do state that there is no evidence that offshore wind surveying associated with the site assessment phase is connected to whale mortalities. 14% of articles were missing this information. This information reflects the most recent federal opinion by NOAA, and that is also echoed by experts who discuss that there has been no evidence of specifically acoustic damage or trauma from the completed necropsies, unlike what has been observed in other species in those instances of physical damage being caused from marine noises in the environment caused by humans. So local articles included this information less than the national and regional articles. About 1 in 5 local articles would not have included this statement. There's a possibility that these articles could have been published prior to NOAA releasing this statement, which was in January 2023 in a press conference when they first publicly made this statement that there is no known connection. This still holds true today, and it emphasizes that there has been no evidence that offshore wind surveying work has potentially caused or been connected to the mortality of these whales. Some articles discussed this and revealed that the no evidence is not perceived as enough by some people, enough to convince people that offshore wind isn't the culprit or still doesn't have potential impacts. So fingers are pointed to offshore wind site assessments as the potential impact, which could have been influencing these mortalities. Yet throughout the articles, the descriptions of survey techniques are limited. Site assessment activities were described in low detail throughout the articles, although there was a consensus among the articles that the main speculation or allegation is that the high-resolution geophysical surveying that's associated with the site assessment phase would be the main culprit of the offshore wind activities. Also, it's important to note that at this time, there had not been any construction efforts in this region for any of those projects that could have potentially had other sound impacts from activities like pile driving. So only 3% of the articles actually use the term high-resolution geophysical to differentiate the type of surveying that's used from offshore wind from other sonar methods. And sonar is used, like I mentioned before, for naval exercises, and then also it's used very commonly for oil and gas exploration. So there were a few articles which compared offshore wind to oil and gas, but a majority of the articles did not include enough information to really support the differences that there are between these technologies that are used. And then also some articles actually mislabeled or used the wrong word or phrase to describe the surveying that's associated with offshore wind. So the experts that I talked to also highlighted that importance of differentiating between the different types of sonar surveying types when assessing what that acoustic impact on the environment is going to be. So this quote here says, "They hear sonar and think Navy sonar." Okay, no, not all Navy sonars are a problem, but some of them have been, like those instances I shared before. but not all sonars are created alike. There's different kinds and they operate with different characteristics. And it's a highly technical issue, which makes it harder for people to relay and easier for people to misunderstand. So a little background about those actual site assessment surveys, which have been deemed a potential culprit in these whale mortalities. These are the high resolution geophysical surveys, and they're important for determining presence of geological features and hazards and archaeological features that are along the seafloor and wind entry areas. And they use an acoustic source to map the seafloor and shallow subsurface. So they are using an acoustic source. It is adding a minimal acoustic footprint on the marine environment, in addition to the acoustic noise that's already down there. But the thing about HRG surveys that are used for offshore wind is that their characteristics really set them apart from other sonar methods that are used in oil and gas and naval testing. So offshore wind surveys are characterized by low power and high frequency used to achieve a high resolution shallow seafloor imaging. They have a lower transmission period or exposure duration and smaller beam widths. The sources used in offshore wind that are detectable potentially by marine mammals produce much lower energy and also travel much shorter distances from the vessel than those that are used in oil and gas exploration, where in oil and gas exploration, the goal is to explore miles and miles below the seafloor to look for potential reserves. So the terms seismic testing and seismic blasting refer to those powerful sound sources such as air guns that are used in oil and gas exploration and are not used in offshore wind site assessments. So someone who hears that maybe, sonar is being used to map out the area for offshore wind, that could be your first instinct, maybe thinking of a story you heard where a more powerful sonar source had a negative impact on marine mammals. So some HRG methods do overlap in the higher hearing range of baleen whales. And there was a recent study that looked at acoustic thresholds for baleen whales. And a reminder, humpbacks and right whales are both baleen whales. And so they looked at acoustic thresholds and basically which level of sound and which frequency of sound would result in long-term or temporary damage to the ear. And based on that scale, the HRG surveys that are used are considered de minimis to baleen whales and are highly unlikely to cause injury or mortality. And that is only if the whales come in contact with the sonar surveying. But exclusion zones exist around offshore wind vessels, and operators must establish an acoustic exclusion zone for geophysical surveys, making sure that the zone is clear of marine mammals, such as these whales. So because of those provisions, the likeliness that there would be a whale in the area that would come in contact with one of these surveys is low. And then the characteristics of the HRG surveys makes that probability that the whale would be injured even lower. One of our experts compared the different acoustic survey types like flashlights. So thinking of a narrow flashlight with a very small beam width would be your HRG survey. It's very focused and very narrow, pinging sound directly to very focused areas of the seafloor. And then an oil and gas survey would be more like a floodlight and encapsulate a lot more of that area. Another finding was that vessel strikes and entanglements are greater and documented threats, but mentioned less frequently. Only 61% of articles mentioned strikes or collisions, and even less so, only 29% of articles mentioned entanglements. And so this was shocking to me just because both of these are documented threats compared to potential impacts from offshore wind, which have not been documented. So local articles were reporting on this even less than national and regional articles. And some articles also mentioned proximity to busy shipping ports as a factor in influencing the probability of vessel strikes in the regions. Articles also alluded that climate change is an emerging factor which has caused shifting prey distribution that could be bringing juvenile humpbacks and North Atlantic right whales even closer to the coast. And anytime they're closer to the coast, they're closer to human activity, and that probability that there could be a vessel strike or an interaction from entanglement just goes up the closer they are to the coast. So again, from doing the background research, I could find that vessel strikes and entanglements have been the main documented causes for these unusual mortality events. And this was also echoed by the experts who I spoke to. One person says, we've known for a long time it's entanglement and fishing gear and vessel strikes. Another person kind of touched on this public input and that they're appreciative that people are thinking about these potential impacts of offshore wind. You know, because in the past there have been a lot of industries with unintended negative environmental consequences. So it's applaudable that we're looking out for whales in advance, but we know that entanglement and vessel strikes are the immediate causes of fatalities, and those are real problems which have not been solved yet. Again, just another quote kind of echoing that same sentiment, that whales are dying from entanglement and ship strikes. It's horrific, and it's pretty much causing the right whale population to go to extinction. But both of these topics are not reported on as frequently as they should be in these articles, which should be sharing information about all different parts of why these mortalities are existing, which we see is not the case. So to conclude everything I just talked about, while 86% of articles do include some information about NOAA's statement that there's no evidence, 18% of local articles do not, which is 1 in 5 local articles. Most articles did not discuss the offshore wind site assessments in detail, or did not use the proper term that differentiates the offshore wind site assessments from more powerful oil and gas or sonar. In addition to that, some articles even use the wrong word, which was very misleading to describe offshore wind as seismic testing or sonar testing, which is associated with those more powerful techniques. And national and regional articles address the additional threats of vessel strikes and entanglement much more than local articles, although overall those documented threats were not mentioned as much as what was expected and what the current science and expert opinion reflects. In addition to these conclusions here, I've also started to analyze the headlines or the titles of the articles that I analyzed. So I wanted from this trying to see whether the news is selling controversy and headlines or coming with a more balanced approach, relying on the best available science instead of just selling controversy. So from those preliminary findings of looking at the headlines, I found that with the tone and the framing, national headlines include more of a mix of balanced and neutral articles, and also articles that could be seen as potentially biased or emotional, focusing on those whale and dolphin deaths. Local headlines were predominantly focused on emotional and sensational reporting, and primarily highlighted the alleged connections between wind farms and marine mammal deaths. There was also more framing at the local level, framing the opposition and the political and community involvement. Overall, the national headlines showed a greater balance, presenting both sides of the debate and relying on fact-checking, research, and calls for investigation for the whales' deaths. Local headlines were less balanced, with a stronger emphasis on the alleged negative impacts of offshore wind and the deaths of marine mammals. So those analysis that I'm working on, I will be expanding on more, and I'm going to continue working on this project. So if anyone is interested and wants to follow up, I'd be happy to talk more about this work. And thank you guys so much for having me, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really great and informative. Quick apologies, we may have lost connectivity for a quick minute there, but just as a reminder to everyone, the recording will be available within 24 hours. We do have a few questions in the chat that we can start asking Sarah. The first one, in your review of the articles that pointed the finger at offshore wind surveys, did you get the impression that there was an intention to misequate offshore wind surveys with the sonar surveys, or rather a lack of background research by the reporters?
I think it more of a lack of background research. In some instances, I think just the lack of using, just using really general terms to describe these surveys instead of using specific terms that would differentiate them from those more powerful survey types, just showed that there wasn't enough background information done. And I think that this, from the expert opinion where they're talking about, it is a highly technical issue. Not everyone understands how marine acoustics works. And it's very, even for me, I had to look into this and make sure that I really understood that technology, because I didn't. So the expectation that it would be reported with that technical expertise and depth in local news articles, I could see why maybe you wouldn't expect that in-depth scientific reporting. It was more prominently reported on in the national and regional articles. So I would say that actually that lack of information, which is really going to help people understand and clarify the differences, is an issue, because it's not giving you the full story and the full picture.
Right. Okay. Great. Thank you. Our next question: who is the authority on the topic of whales for the industry? Are there certain bodies of regulation that hold reliable, evidence-based information that industry members should turn to?
So, through this, I relied a lot on the information that the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, NIMFS, put out. And I think it's important to remember that although BOEM is tasked with facilitating development of offshore wind, that whales are not have not been a second thought for a lot of these federal agencies. They have been at the forefront of research being done, especially around the North Atlantic right whale, who might receive a little more attention because of their critically endangered status. But NOAA and NIMS have been doing a lot of passive marine, passive acoustic monitoring to try to determine the presence of whales in these wind energy areas. So they have a lot of really good relevant reports that I would turn to. They also put out serious injury and mortality determinations. So I'm still actually waiting for the serious injury and mortality determination for 2023. It takes a while for them to process all of that information, and they go through like really in-depth parts of necropsies that, collecting that data lasts. It can take months, and they want to make sure that they get it right. So once that determination is put out, which it should be expected sometime soon in this summer or early fall, hopefully, that will shed a lot more light on the determined causes of what some of these mortalities have been.
Okay, great. That sounds like a good resource for people to use if they're interested. Another question, how can members of the offshore wind supply chain in the United States be better stewards for marine mammals while advocating for project development?
That's a great question. So I think it really is all about information and where people are getting information. So the first step has always been for myself to make sure that I understand the different components of the topic before I start sharing information to other people, and making sure that you're using science-based information to support your argument. I definitely think that this study identifies an additional need for more information dissemination about these more technical aspects of offshore wind, which the general public may not have as much of a background to easily understand topics like impacts of underwater noise. So in my role right now at Oregon Sea Grant, one of the things that I'm trying to do is, create informational resources that are palatable to people who might not have science or technical backgrounds. I think it really is, and then there's also the kind of misinformation, disinformation component of it. I think the best way to combat that is with data that's, backed by science and backed by research. And it is happening. So it is and again, I also didn't, some of my slides have sources throughout, but if anyone's curious about any of the sources that I used, please reach out and I can get you connected to those resources too.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
A similar kind of question based off that last one is, how do you think we can work at correcting misinformation on a local level?
Yeah. So part of this that interests me, which I didn't include really any analysis of social media. This was all focused on these news articles. And some people may argue that news and local news is maybe a dying breed compared to where people are getting their information from today. But social media has just made communication so easy. And I've seen myself many instances where there's disinformation or misinformation circulating about this topic. Again, I think the best thing to combat that is having scientific information that can be backed up, opposed to just speculations that have been circulating by word of mouth, because, and then that's what part of this project is. I wanted to kind of look into what the available science is, and it is available, it's there. And although there's no evidence that has connected offshore wind to any of these mortalities, there's evidence that these mortalities have been caused by other things like vessel strikes and entanglement, and that exists. And that information, if people are interested in this topic, they should know all sides of the story.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Our next question: is it possible for members of the public to access the necropsy results or reports from the mortality events?
Yeah, so that NOAA on their websites, they have pretty nice digestible overviews of the unusual mortality events. If you Google humpback whale unusual mortality event or right whale unusual mortality event, they put together some pretty good resources if you want to learn more about it. And within those resources, there are links to reports which outline those determinations with more technical details. And you can look at the past serious injury and mortality report to get an idea of what those documented threats have been. And again, soon the 2023 serious injury and mortality report should be available, and that is publicly available.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
A New Jersey question. As you mentioned, some of the fiercest opposition for offshore wind comes out of New Jersey. As a native of the state, do you have any suggestions on how industry advocates can best reach those folks with the best available information?
It's a good question.
It's very similar to the
Yeah.
local too.
So I think it's interesting that a lot of the, it seems like a lot more of this, and this is maybe something that a lot of people have started to pick up on, that maybe this isn't really about the whales, maybe this is just about offshore wind opposition. And that's kind of what some of our experts echoed, is that people who are really concerned about the potential impact to marine mammals from offshore wind may not be as involved on the topics of vessel strikes and entanglements. And, not a single article mentioned any claims to stop commercial shipping or commercial fishing, which, from what I've shown, you can see has just as much, if not more, of an impact on that marine environment. I really think that the best thing to do is to make this bring the science to communities who might not be going out and looking for it. And the hope is that people who are genuinely concerned and interested in these whale species, especially the right whale, there's so much concern over them because of their small population, would be receptive to the science that proves that vessel strikes and entanglements are documented.
It's a great point. Thank you. Do you have any resources that would help to explain the differences between oil and gas surveys and HGS in plain language that could be used on outreach to the public?
Yeah, so BOEM does have a whole acoustic branch where they've laid out they have some nice videos and infographics about the difference between those surveys. I really like the analogy of the flashlight versus the floodlight. I think that actually helped me, who, I focus on social science and engagement. Me, who is less technical, kind of like see the bigger picture. So there are definitely good resources that you can start from on BOEM and NOAA's websites about marine acoustics and the difference in those survey types. One of the if you're looking for a more technical scientific article that you could synthesize, I think it's Ruppel et al. If my slides are available, it should be in there as a source on that acoustics page. And that was a report put out recently, which kind of outlined the potential impacts from all these different acoustic sounds associated with offshore wind development.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
I did like that analogy with the flashlight. That helped to visualize it really well too.
Yeah.
Why was the population listed as 330 non-calf individuals? Is it because only the population able to breed is important to an endangered species?
Yeah, so unfortunately, recently, and again, this information is available on NOAA's Unusual Mortality event website, that calves, because they're sensitive and they're babies, they have an even harder time acclimating to the environment and are more susceptible to the different threats in their environment. So they include non-calf individuals just until those calves get to the reproductive age. And then there are only about 70 breeding females. And because they're marine mammals, they don't have a ton of live young. They're, having one calf a year, if any. So their population, it's having a hard time sustaining itself in a really busy marine environment where there are threats from vessel strikes and entanglements. And right whales swim around with their mouth open, feeding often, so they're even more susceptible to entanglements in fishing gear and loose debris.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Was your article search limited to the East Coast, or did you take into account the more recent offshore wind HRG survey efforts on the West Coast, where similar misinformation has been seen in the local media?
So, no, not with local articles. We're only focused on that New Jersey case study. There were national articles, but again, like I said, the national articles were a little bit more balanced and relied more on including scientific information than local articles. But in my role now on the West Coast, I'm seeing a lot of similarities with this topic coming up, and I think the best way to combat it is just through learning. It's really a learning opportunity. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll do one more question here, unless anybody else submits any in the live Q&A chat. This one's a little bit similar to a few we've addressed, but during your research, did you get the sense that the local opposition could potentially be more rooted in anti-offshore wind than concern for the whale populations?
I think so, and I think that was reflected by the non-inclusion of vessel strikes and entanglements as the documented threats. I would say, and there are, people have mapped out the sources of where these allegations have come from. But again, I think a lot of it is maybe just misunderstanding and a lack of readily available information that describes these technical components of offshore wind in a digestible way. Like I said before, someone who hears, oh, they're doing sonar testing to plan for offshore wind out on the coast. You may just hear that phrase, you hear sonar, and make a connection between the acoustic disturbance and whale populations, knowing that whales are very charismatic creatures who are really reliant on communication using sound.
Okay, well, thank you so much for addressing all of our questions.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you everybody for attending and listening in on our first webinar of the series. Really quickly, we'll let you all know about our next upcoming webinar. It will be September 15th, and that'll be a technical evaluation of floating offshore wind plants and installation operations. And then after that, here is our schedule for our upcoming webinars, September through December. So please sign up and join these if you enjoyed this one as well. And thank you, everybody.